Well, I'm going to start with this photo, which is taken on the Vaga River of northern Russia on January 7th, 1919. The soldier there is Private Alfred Shunk of Company A, standing sentry duty. In the far distance, you can see a Russian village, and maybe you can make out the onion dome there that would mark the church. This was the view of the Company A had in that area. It's northern central Russia, southeast of Archangel. And I can just imagine him standing there, freezing, 60 below temperatures, and asking himself, how did I get here? And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about how Alfred got to where he was standing there on January 7th, 1919, 101 years ago. The story begins obviously with World War I, the Great War. Most people know about the Western Front in France, where the Allies, the Americans, French, and British fought the Germans pretty much to a standstill, especially Britain and England for 3 years. But there was also an Eastern Front, which ran through Eastern Prussia, down through the Caucasus. And the Russian army was in a standoff themselves with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, which is very beneficial to the Allies because they kept the German troops in that region pinned down. And there were hundreds of thousands of troops that otherwise could have joined the fight on the Western Front. Forward to late 1917 and the Russian Revolution, and Vladimir Lenin, I always want to call him Putin, sort of slip of the tongue, takes power and, as promised, takes Russia out of the war. This allows Germany to start transferring its troops to the Western Front, where many of them joined in an initial massive offensive that began on March 21st, 1918, hitting to the west and aiming to split the forces of the British and the French. And the first punch of that offensive, a series of offensives, was very successful, nearly split the British army. It was finally halted mainly because they outran their supplies. They were moving so fast. There are other offensives that followed, including one in May that crossed the Chemin des Dames and was hurled south and was stopped only at Belleau Wood, which is about 30 miles from Paris. So the Germans were on a roll. And I should mention that it was the 2nd Division, including the Marines, who stopped that drive at Belleau Wood at great cost. Anyway, so through the spring of 1918, the Allies are obviously in some peril, and they began casting about for some way to alleviate the pressure. And they hit on this idea of an intervention in northern Russia that would recreate the Eastern Front and perhaps stop the withdrawal of German troops to the west. And if maybe even if it was more successful, it would draw Germany to bring more troops to the east again and alleviate the pressure. It was initiated by the Allied command, particularly the British liked the idea. It involved the French, Italians, other actors in the war. And they tried to pressure President Woodrow Wilson to join them, but he wanted to keep all of those American forces employed on the Western Front. They thought that was more important than any sideshow.
James, if I can interrupt real quick, pardon me. Could you hit your podium button again? The slides aren't quite full screen.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
no worries. I was having a hard time looking at the.
Yeah, now you can see Pagasta better. That's good. All right. I didn't know it didn't take. Anyway, so Wilson declined the offer to send any American troops to Russia, but he did agree to send a single warship, the SS Olympian, which traveled to England first and picked up the British commander, General Frederick Poole, commander of the intervention, and then continued on to Murmansk and then to Archangel. But first, let's talk a little bit, though, about where they are. I'm going to go back. This is the map we're talking about. So you can see Archangel there at the top, sort of left, right center. There's a railroad track heading south. You can see Obozerskaya, about probably 60 to 80 miles further down there. and the Davina River, which runs basically south-southeast from Archangel into the hinterlands. And then below that, there's a tributary called the Vaga River. If you can see any towns, like Schenkirk is down there, almost at the bottom right of the map. So the overall strategy was that they were going to land troops in northern Russia at Archangel. They were going to send these troops forward, and they had in mind that they were going to have all these loyalists, Tsarists, anti-Bolsheviks would join forces, and they would basically go and reconstitute the Eastern Front and bring the Germans back into the fight. And that was their idea. But there was an overreaching idea that went beyond that among some, that the idea was they were going to reach out, to go down the Davina River to the southeast, reach Kotlas town 500 miles away, and then try to find, locate, and turn around this ephemeral force known as the Czech Legion, 40,000 to 70,000 former Russian prisoners of war who had been given permission to leave Russia via Vladivostok and were rolling east, headed for Siberia. They wanted to take these soldiers, turn them around, and then head west and take Vologda, which is below the map. Maybe you can see on the smaller inset map in the center there, St. Petersburg, possibly even Moscow, and undo the Russian Revolution. So this was their grand kind of high in the sky idea that they were going to change history, not only just reconstitute the Eastern Front, but that was never going to happen, obviously. But they began implementing the plan, and they kept pressuring Wilson to join in. And finally, in mid-July 1918, he finally acquiesced. He spent a long night just going back and forth in this document called Aide de Memoire, where he first argued all the reasons that he wasn't going to send troops to Russia, and then all the reasons he was going to, and he ultimately did, but he's decided it's going to be a single regiment, and they were going to have the proviso that they were not to engage in combat with the Bolsheviks or anyone else. They were merely going to Archangel to guard stores, millions of dollars worth of material, foods, other supplies that had been sent to the Russians for their war effort by the Allies. So that was, the die was cast at that point. He selected, or someone selected, the 339th Regiment from the 85th Division. Maybe the reason being that they're mainly Michiganders from all over Michigan, but they also, part of their nickname was Detroit's Own. So obviously there was a contingent of Detroiters in there. And there were some Wisconsin and some odd draftees from Illinois, Camp Grant, where my grandfather had trained, Kentucky. But they figured they'd be well adapted to fighting in the cold. This regiment was training at Camp Custer in Monroe County. And in late July, entrained for New York, and then sailed across to England, all believing that they'd soon be in France on the Western Front. But rumors started emerging that that was not going to be their destination. In fact, there's one little anecdote. There was a lieutenant with the Company A, Harry Meade, who had been from Valparaiso, Indiana. His family ran a boarding house there and took in a lot of students at Valparaiso University. One of them had been Lowell Thomas some years before, the globe-trotting journalist who had just come back to England from promoting Lawrence of Arabia. And he ran into Harry on a London street corner, and Harry said, "Hey, I'm just about ready to go to France." And Lowell's like, "Well, that's not what we heard. You're going to Russia." And sure enough, they started issuing winter clothing. They got lectured to by Ernest Shackleton, the famed Antarctic explorer. And before they knew it, they had swapped their American rifles for a Russian-designed, American-made rifle called the Mosin Nagant, which the men complained the aim was so poor it could shoot around corners. But the reason they gave them those rifles was because there were millions of bullets in Archangel, supposedly waiting for them to shove down the barrels. So they went tooling across England in August, and boarded 3 ships for the trip across the Arctic Circle. First, their destination was actually Murmansk. But in the meantime, the British had indeed landed a force at Murmansk with some French forces. And then in early August, entered the White Sea and entered the harbor at Archangel. And when the Bolsheviks heard that they were on their way, they began looting all the stores that the Americans were being sent to protect. And they started placing them on boats and going up the Divina, down the railway. Basically, they took anything that wasn't nailed down and took off. So when the British showed up and the USS Olympia, the US warship, there wasn't much to scavenge. Interesting sideshow, though, is that aboard the Olympia, there was a group of sailors, 50 in all. Half of them were under the command of a guy named Donald Hicks. And they were all eager beavers, American sailors, and they found an old locomotive. They got it to work, and then went chugging down the railway line toward Obozerskaya. Got finally waylaid on the way, but had a grand adventure for about a week, and then went back out and spent much of August fighting, trying to reach Obozerskaya and take it before they got repulsed and then became hopelessly lost, and emerged onto the railroad tracks finally above Obozerskaya on September 5th. In the meantime, the ships carrying the 339th Regiment had been diverted from Murmansk with the purpose of saving the sailors from the Olympia, even though they didn't need saving at that point. And the ships landed at Archangel and Barkazia on September 5th, 1918. Far from not fighting, these troops were immediately sent to war, basically. The 1st Battalion was sent up the Divina on barges. The 3rd Battalion was sent by railroad towards Obozerskaya. Both battalions almost immediately began fighting Bolsheviks along the way. They were able to brush them aside in some instances, but they were held up eventually on both battalions. The 1st Battalion reached about just beyond 180 miles southeast of Archangel by mid-September. Had a few short skirmishes with some Bolos out there. Took refuge in a town called Seltzo, which I think is on the map there on the Divina River. And then were rudely pushed out of there in October by Russian gunships. The Divina had not frozen yet. And they had taken refuge in blockhouses and were putting up enforcements or reinforcements, but they came out under a heavy bombardment. And they wound up retreating back north to a village called Tulgas, which they started reinforcing. I'm going to show you one more. This is the bunch from the SS Olympia. I don't know which one is Donald Hicks, since they didn't label it, but I love these guys, and they just look so eager. But what happened to Donald Hicks, I don't know. I've never really heard anything more about him. I did try to look, in fact. That is Archangel back in the day, where the 339th landed. One side note too is the 339th, they had, these ships had been ridden with the flu bug that was circling the globe at the time. And the men aboard those ships, many of them became sick en route. Some died before they even reached Archangel and had burials at sea. And eventually about 75 of these men over the course of September 1918 died from the flu in this forsaken place. No idea what they're doing there. So it's just a very sad note to that. Meanwhile, on the railroad line, companies L and M and K tried to fight their way beyond Obozerskaya. Company K went on a side mission trying to take a town called Kodish on to the southeast, and spent most of the fall and winter of 1918, 1919 trying to take Kodish. They finally did take it. Then they relinquished it, then they took it again, and then they finally burned it. So it wasn't anything. They were trying to push through to Plesetskaya, which was the main what the men called the Bolsheviks bolos, the main bolo base about 20 miles beyond that. But there was this feudal fighting, ever constant fighting. Company M and L, meanwhile, and I tried to push down the railroad tracks. They found in their way a heavy fortified Russian locomotive and artillery. And so they were inching their way south at great effort and through the swamps trying to do end runs. They wound up maybe going 10 to 15 miles beyond Obozerskaya before winter began to set in and they found themselves stopped. Meanwhile, back on the Dvina on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, Company B, which was trying to fortify its position there, was attacked by hundreds of bolos who had traversed these swamps to the west that they had thought was unpassable, came screaming out of the swamps, out of the woods on the morning, killed about a dozen Company B men. Luckily, they had been shipped a Canadian battery that fall, and basically their lives were spared when the Canadian batteries, these are hardened gunners, fired point blank into this hordes of Bolsheviks, and were able to escape with their lives. But actually didn't escape, they stayed there through the winter, continuing to fortify, running patrols, and then wondering, especially after Armistice Day, as soldiers across the front did, what are we doing here? What's our mission here? It was never really explained to them. The pie in the sky was they were going to push 500 miles to Kotlas by winter, and they didn't even get halfway there. They were going to go to past Obozerskaya, another 300 miles to Vologda. They got about 10, 15 miles beyond Obozerskaya before it bogged down. They also sent Company H to the Onega in the west to guard the western flank. They sent part of Company G to Panega in the northeast. Let's see, I get that map back. If you can even see that. Onega is, you can see Onega Bay, so that river valley there, running down from there. And the Panega is to the northeast, sort of east-northeast of Archangel. And there were some pitched battles there. Company M actually wound up going back up there after around Christmas time and spent about a month or two helping Company G patrol and fortify that area. So mainly, basically, within months, you basically had another stalemate, just like the Western Front. And meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were recruiting and conscripting and bringing their forces to what by summer would be 600,000 man Red Army. There were never more than 11,000 Allied troops in the northern Russia area. And by the time summer rolled around, they were facing off against 45,000 Bolsheviks. This is the railway front. That's a part of Company M heading down the way to probably take up their positions. That is J. Brooks Nichols. He was a wealthy Detroit businessman who was promoted to command the 3rd Battalion, and he worked out of a railroad car stationed on the tracks. And you see him working at his desk there. This, meanwhile, we mentioned Company B at Tulgas, spent most of the winter patrolling. Had some ambushes. They lost some men. They lost one man. It's taken prisoner and severely wounded, and he didn't get out of Russia until 1920. So there were prisoners taken, but it's interesting about the prisoners is they were treated very well. Some of them were brought to Moscow, and they were able to use the library facilities. They could scrounge some money and go eat a horse flesh steak, where most of Moscow's residents were starving. So some died. There's one who died in a hospital in Vologda, but he had been wounded. So basically, you've got this situation which had been promoted by the British General Frederick Poole, who had the grand ambition that they were going to undo the revolution. He was one of those proponents. Interestingly, he decided in October to go on vacation in the middle of all this. And so they brought in another commander, General Edmund Ironsides, who came to Russia, traveled around, went to the various fronts, realized the situation was hopeless, and but it was too late to do anything about it because he worried that if they tried to withdraw troops at that stage, they'd be caught out in the open and they'd be more defenseless than if they just spent the winter in their fortifications, better protection. And he actually, though, was so concerned about security, he had like a ring built of forts south of Archangel, because just in case the Bolsheviks decided to get brave and go after the interventionists at Archangel, they'd have some protection against that. The winter progressed. Company A of the 1st Battalion had been sent to Shenkursk on the Vaga. Let's see if you can even see that, which is sort of middle lower right. Actually, it's where they were, far bottom right. If you can make out Nizhny Gora, Vicenzo Gorga, Aspodenga. Anyway, Company A wound up patrolling that area. And Ironside visited them once more just on January 18th, 1919. And the next day, he was lucky to get out by the skin of his teeth. The next day, the 46-man 4th Platoon, commanded by Harry Meade, the same who had ran into Lowell Thomas, was attacked by 1,100 Bolsheviks and were put to flight. There were probably half a dozen of them were killed on the spot. They raced towards Vizorka Gora, where the main part of the company was, took refuge there in some of the bunkers and log buildings they had, but the Bolo artillery just rolled up and started blasting them to bits. So the decision finally was made to keep heading north, and they went to Shenkursk, which is a fairly large village for the area, but that came under artillery attack too, so that the entire village was evacuated. So it became this huge 1,000-person, maybe more, line of refugees heading north. And the Company A's survivors, and finally some men from Company F, wound up defending a new position at Vistavka, you can see, which is above Shagovari, if you can make that out. But it's on much further north than their exposed position at Nizhny Gora. So Alfred Shunk, who was a man seen on sentry duty on the Vaga, the initial photograph, was one of those that was put to flight, and I believe he made it. So the situation was poor all across the front. The men were becoming restless. In Company B at Tulgas, there was a platoon headed by a Silver Parish corporal, and they circulated a petition and signed it, saying that they aren't gonna do their duties anymore until somebody can tell us what the hell we're doing here. Why are we here? We're 3 months past the armistice. There were small mutinies amongst the French, amongst the SBALs, they called them the soldiers with the Slavic British Alliance, something like that. There were a small hiccup. Mike Robel will know about this with Company I, that one of the soldiers in March basically pitched a little fit and say they were being sent down the railway line, and they're like, then it was the same thing. It's like, what are we doing here? When are we leaving? And they couldn't get an answer from anyone. And they were basically read the Articles of War by Edmund Ironside, and it kind of blew over. Company B, because Silver Parish, they wound up giving him, citing him, or orders, basically, sort of swashing him. Nothing more was said of it, but it was desperate, and the military command knew that they needed to get troops out of there, certainly by the spring. And Woodrow Wilson had finally come around too, and in February said, yeah, let's get them out of there, which was impossible because the White Sea was frozen over, so they had to wait till basically, the ice melted on the sea before anybody could go anywhere. But they started withdrawing by leaps and bounds. But first, there was one last pitched battle at a place called Bolshevik, just west of Obozerskaya, a little southwest there. Company M was involved. Company H came down the Onega Valley to the west of them. There were some other Allied troops involved. Several hundred men possibly spread out and faced off against a Bolo force of 7,000 soldiers. And with artillery help, they wound up killing, wounding, or taking prisoner 2,000 of these Bolshevik warriors, and so won the day. Take a few. This is a typical blockhouse that you would have seen, like a Tulgas. They could fire through the slits there. This is the officers of Company A. Harry Meade is second from the left in the front row. And those are on the right, those are Canadian artillery officers. And this is at Nizhny Gora. Prior to the attack on Company A, the Bolos had been trying to infiltrate their numbers at night. And this is one of the Bolshevik soldiers who was shot, and he's sort of being displayed there for the camera. And I do want to note too that while I'm doing this, most of these photos come from the Bentley Historical Library in Ann Arbor. And they're Signal Corps, but I obtained them from them. They would like me to say that. And then we're back to here. That would be what the morning of January 19th would have looked like too. This is a dead soldier, Bolshevik soldier at Bolshia Ozerki. One note is that during that battle, during the Russians attacked Company M and the rest, one of the commanders of the Bolsheviks mistakenly rode his horse right into the lines and got pulled from it. He's probably killed, but they wound up with his sword. That's Company M commander Joel Moore having a good laugh over the sword that was taken from him. So they began pulling back to Archangel by leaps and bounds, started gathering around Archangel. Finally, in the early part of June 1919, everybody got their wish and they started sailing from the port. They brought 100 bodies of those who had died, probably most of them who had been flu victims from the previous fall, with them, sailed first to France and then to the US. And the first polar bears, they had started calling themselves, arrived in Detroit on July 3rd, 1919. And there was a huge celebration the next day, obviously, 4th of July. They were feted. And so they came in dribs and drabs throughout the month until finally the polar bears were home. But it had been such a jarring and unique experience that there was a certain bond that they shared, obviously, to go through an ordeal like that. I mean, it was 60 below, howling winds, 5 feet of snow. Conditions were horrible. And it was really just, I think for the average soldier, it was a lot worse than they would have found on the Western Front, although the casualties were much lower. The 339th and its associated units suffered about 225 casualties. Anyway, so back in Detroit through the 20s, they formed into the Polar Bear Association. And somebody came up with the idea of going back to Russia and retrieving the bodies of the roughly 120 men that they had left behind. And through machinations, they raised some money. The State Department helped them. Russia ultimately said, okay, you can come back in and look for your dead. Relations had eased somewhat. But Russia had, I should mention, after the troops left, the British didn't leave until September 1919, but the Civil War resumed in northern Russia, and Archangel fell in February of 1920. And the reprisals were brutal. Some people say that there was 30,000 reprisal killings once the Bolsheviks were in power there. So it didn't come cheap. Anyway, so they raised funds and got the papers and were able to get back into Russia, and they spread out and they went to Kodish, they went to the railroad front, they went to Tulgas, they went to Seltso, up to Davina. They lived with the peasants. The food was horrible, but they located about 85 bodies of the men and were able to transport them back to Archangel. then back to the US. Half of those bodies were claimed by relatives. The rest were moved on to Detroit, where they went into storage for the winter. And then on Memorial Day, 1930, there was a ceremony. They were interred in plots. Been there, it's a really powerful place, around a polar bear statue that the association had also commissioned. And that's my photo. Yeah, so they were 85 men were interred around this marvelous statue here. And I can only sum up really by just saying, for the survivors, they spent the rest of their lives really wondering what they had been doing there. They never felt they got a good answer about it. They went on with their lives as best they could, but it's quite an interesting sideshow to the Great War at large. And there's more in this thing. How did that get in there? I always do that. Anyway, that's pretty much my little presentation.
Well, we've had a few questions come in. Robert asks, you mentioned the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And he wants to know, is that the one we heard about last year?
I'm sorry, what?
He wants to know if that's the one we heard about last year. I'm guessing.
Last year?
I'm
Oh,
guessing yes.
well, I'm sure it's similar. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty bad. Obviously, I mean, it killed millions worldwide.
Yeah.
You know,
It was also a pandemic.
Oh yeah, it was a huge pandemic. Yeah, I mean, it afflicted soldiers on the Western Front all around. I mean, I only called it Spanish because the first cases came. Spain was basically the first country that allowed itself to say that they had cases. So, but it most likely originated at Camp Funston in Kansas. Those are the first outbreaks in the U.S. And then they sent those, raw recruits to France. They're sick, and yeah, it spread like wildfire. So maybe it's really the American flu.
Another question from Dennis. How many Signal Corps soldiers were with the polar bears?
How many Signal Corps?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how big a Signal Corps unit is. Maybe Mike Grobel knows better than I do. Mike is the president of the Polar Bear Memorial Association. I saw him sign on here, but I really wouldn't know. I mean, I know an infantry company was 250 men. The platoon is 46. I don't know how many Signal Corps units they had. I don't know. I can't venture a guess.
Oh, Mike, he chimed in. He said 3 men.
3 men to a unit? Oh,
yeah.
I'm glad I didn't guess. I would have said 50.
The other question with that was, are there only still photos that exist? Was there any film?
No, I've seen some footage, I believe. Yeah, there is some actual footage. And like I mentioned, a lot of these photos that I used here are Signal Corps. Boy, they were everywhere. They did a great job. It's just incredible. They're using them in all my books. And yeah, if he's related to a former Signal Corps man, that's pretty cool.
Oh, Mike has also chimed in. About 55 minutes of film exists.
Okay.
Hey, Mike, where can people view that, or is that in archives somewhere? Just curious. Oh, it's on YouTube.
Okay, that's probably where I saw it. I think I saw a link on Facebook or something like that. Maybe Mike put it up on his site. He's got a Facebook page devoted to the polar bears. He does a lot of talks too. It's a great organization.
Our director would like to remind you that you don't have to type in. You can also raise your hand and we'll give you microphone access if you'd like to ask your question live. Let's see, a bunch of questions coming in. Did the US troops live off the land by hunting and trapping?
That's a good question. I was going to actually get to that. Actually, they were often, I'm not saying in every case, but they were like at Tulgas, Company B took up quarters with the locals. The locals would move upstairs in their houses, whatever, huts. And these are crude dwellings. The soldiers would live downstairs, basically. They were supplied with food, the soldiers, but no, they didn't have to live off the land, but they were sheltered. Probably on the railway line, there might have been more roughing it and around Codish, because there just weren't that many structures, especially after they burned the town down. So, yeah, it was rough. And, it's so cold. I'll mention one other thing that I always found funny. I forgot to mention yours. They're issued, when they were going to Russia, they were issued something called the Vickers gun. It's a machine gun. It's water cooled. And so when it's 60 below, it doesn't work that great. So the men would resort to like bringing this machine gun into their sleeping bags with them at night to try to keep them warm so they work the next day. So that's the kind of conditions they are up against, and the kind of ill preparation that went into this whole operation.
Right. Yeah, in a write-up of your book, it mentioned that Michiganders were chosen because they could probably handle the cold.
Yeah,
I don't know that it ever got to
makes
60
sense.
below.
Yeah, and there were a number of men from Wisconsin too.
Mhm.
But yeah, you wouldn't make that much sense to send Alabamians there, probably
No, no.
Arizonans.
Let's see, Dave has a question. Dave, would you like to ask it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Hey, Jim, thanks. I read your book. I picked it up and read it. I enjoyed it very much.
Nice. Appreciate it.
Heck of a lot of research. I noticed you did in that book, incredible amount of research. But in reading the book, it seems like you take pains to describe the battle situation where a lot of our deceased soldiers actually, how they were killed in battle. And did you get a chance to do that for all those who lost their lives there, or and was that kind of an objective, a way to honor their sacrifices, to give them a
what I tried to do is I tried to personalize it. I tried to find through my research stories I could concentrate on and try to bring them to life a little bit. Clifford Phillips was one, Francis Cuff was another. So to humanize it and just say, instead of saying there were 12 people dead, this is who Francis Cuff was. He was hacked to death by bolos when he was ambushed on patrol. So it was really, that was what I was trying to do, was kind of personalize it. That's what I do with all my books. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciated that. Did you ever go to Russia to?
No, but
do
Mike
your
Robel
research?
did. He went a
Mike
couple
did,
of years
okay.
ago. I thought about it, but it's a bit daunting, and I know it's quite a process. Mike could tell you at some point. But at the same time, I signed my contract for this book in October of 2017. And by that time of year in Russia, and it was due in April. So I don't think I was going to see a whole lot of Russia, and there's no sun and the effort involved. Anyway, yeah. I would have loved to, though. I've gone to France 3 times for my different other books. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank Mike. Turns out my grandfather, who immigrated from Greece in 1912, enlisted in 1918. And the only information we have on that is our family had was a picture of him in uniform. So I'm a member of the Facebook page for the Polar Bear Association. So I posed a question to the group, and Mike and some of his colleagues got back to me and got me some specifics about his service and what units he served in and things like that.
That's great.
Thank you for
for
some
anybody
light
out
on
there
that, Mike.
ancestor, the Bentley Historical Library has a searchable database where you can just like punch in a soldier's name and see what they have if he comes up. It's really handy. I mean,
in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, in Ann Arbor. Yeah, at the University of
Okay.
Michigan. That's a terrific resource. I mean, I called it in my book, one-stop shopping. It really is a great place. They devoted this whole section of the library to photos. They collect diaries, memoirs, whatever they got. It's really handy.
Thank you. I'll check it out. I'm
Thanks.
an Ann Arbor guy. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to also give a nice thumbs up to the Bentley. I've done a lot of research there too, and the staff is incredible.
Oh yeah, they're great.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. How far from Archangel were the American troops stationed?
Okay. I estimated my number I used in my book, like Nizhny Gora, the farthest flung outpost which was attacked, Company A. I'm saying about 250 miles. I think Tool Gus is maybe 180 miles. I might be wrong, but it's hard to tell as the crow flies. Oboes or Sky, I think we put it's 80 to 100 miles south of Archangel. Onega, the whole front from Onega to the Panega, was probably, we're talking several hundred miles. So, and then we're talking about a single regiment, that was strung out, 5,500 men. That's a lot of territory to try to take or to defend. So yeah, it was like, trying to defend Wyoming, with a single regiment, something like that.
Marty, would you like to ask your question? You have to unmute yourself.
That was you.
Oh,
Marty.
there you go.
No thanks.
Oh, no? Okay. And here's Mike.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just finish adding a link here in the chat box. 1 second. Yeah, I just wanted to add in that the Bentley website has a roster. I've got a link to their website where you can search the roster. Just go to pbma.global.org. And I just put that link in the chat box. From there, you can access their online searchable roster. Also on that same page that I gave the link, retired Lieutenant Colonel has taken it on himself, Rod Hostler, to gather not only the information from the Bentley site, but from other sources to create a roster. So I also have a link to that one, and that can be searched using Control plus F. It's just a single web page, but he has it organized by units, which is much better if you're really looking to see who all was in a single unit, as opposed to just doing searching by name in the Bentley roster. Plus, over the last 2 years, everybody that's contacted me that I've done research on and we've been able to verify, I've added all those names to that roster. So that one's probably the most complete of all. And there's a link to that also on the page in the link that I just gave you.
Good. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Jim.
Yeah, Mike's grandfather served with Company I, the 339th.
Yeah, and I did have a chance to go to Archangel in August of 2018. In fact, I arrived on the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the British, August 2nd. And it was just coincidence. I wanted to get there before the weather got too bad, but
That's for sure.
and I hit a nice warm spell. It got up to about 80 the first few days there, so it was nice weather. And I was able to take the train down with my tour guide and friend Alexei Sukhanovsky, who's a Russian Civil War buff. In this case, he knows where all these battles were, where they took place. He's done military archaeology at them, and he has a base camp right at the former front lines on the railroad front. So we got off in the middle of nowhere, which is what that is now, and spent a long weekend there. I got to walk in some of the same trenches my grandfather walked in because he was in Company I and spent most of his time at the railroad front when he wasn't back in reserve or back in Archangel for training and R&R. And that's where they were in March of 1919, Company I, when they were told to pack their bags and get ready to go back to the front lines. And the alleged mutiny took place. Then everybody just sort of walked around and scuffed their feet on the floor and didn't make any attempt to move to start packing when they got the order from their sergeant. So the sergeant panicked, and instead of going up the line to his next in command, he called Colonel Stewart, who was in charge of all the American troops there in North Russia. So he came over and read them the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They asked a few questions, basically, why are we here? And what are we doing? And he basically told them we're here to make sure that the Bolsheviks don't push us back into the White Sea, and we're working on getting you out. They accepted it. They got their bags packed, and 2 days later, they were in the middle of a firefight at the front lines, and they acquitted themselves very well. So it wasn't a matter of not wanting to fight. It was a matter of wanting to find out, why they were there and when they were going to get out.
Yeah, they were there because they were there.
Yep.
That's one for sure.
Thanks, Mike. And to let everyone know, the links that we've mentioned will be shared on our Facebook page, but they're also there in the chat.
Okay.
Someone asked, were the bodies of all the polar bears who died in Russia recovered and brought home?
That's a good question. I should have mentioned there's about 24 that remain unlocated. In fact, I was in France a couple of years ago, and we went to the military cemetery of Romaine. And to my shock, this was before the book came out, but they're on the wall, the missing at that cemetery, which is basically World War I American cemetery. They have the names of about 24 missing polar bears on that. I had no idea that they had that, which is pretty cool. But yeah, there's probably men who died and crawled off of the bush, and they're still there. I mean, who knows? Like I said, there were one of the prisoners remains unlocated. So differing circumstances. So, but it's amazing they were able to retrieve 85 bodies. You think about the conditions they were under. They had to go on local hearsay, probably. I think we saw a body over here 10 years ago, something like that, or a small grave in the middle of nowhere. So they did a good job.
Yeah. Where exactly is the polar bear statue and memorial located?
It's at the Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan, just above Detroit. And I can't describe where it is. It's like in the middle of the cemetery, as I recall, kind of. But it's really striking. It's about, 8 feet tall, and it's marble, and it's beautiful.
Stanley has a question. Stanley?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I grew up in the 50s. We had an elderly gentleman staying with us who we called Uncle Joe. Turns out he was my dad's cousin, but he was a Polish expatriate. He was ethnic Polish. And he joined the Canadian Army prior, because he wanted to fight. So he joined the Canadian Army. Family lore has it that he was in Russia. Were there any Canadian infantry? You mentioned Canadian.
I don't think so. I mean, I think the only Canadians I'm aware of are they're artillerists. I can't think. I know they had, they had Highlanders, and they had all these different British troops and stuff. Classic regimental names, King's Own or whatever they were. But I don't recall seeing any evidence of Canadian infantry.
If I were to research something like that, where would I start?
Well, you can, if he joined the Canadian Army, there's a great resource up there in Ottawa. It's like the National Library or whatever. I mean, they have a searchable database too. I've used it before. Punch in a name, and they might have records. They do a really good job up there. Unlike here, where basically all the service records for the Doughboys burned in 1973, including my grandfather's. But Canada has maintained great records, and they would have extensive records, like daily stuff almost,
Is that searchable on the internet, or do you have to go?
Yeah. Go to their site. It's like the, I don't know, National Library of Canada or National Historical, whatever, Museum, something like that. Think around it, you'll find it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Rosalie? Okay. We do have a comment that Canadians were stationed in Siberia, so that could.
You know, that's a good point. Yeah, he might want to. He might want to. It might be. There might be a record. But yeah, maybe that's where, if he was in Russia, maybe that's where he was. You know? Because there were two interventions. There's the one in Archangel, and there's this 2-regiment intervention in Vladivostok, and they were sent in about the same time, fall of 18. They didn't even get out until 1920, but that's a whole nother story. So, you know, and so that could well be. That's a very good point.
Richard, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Very good program. Enjoyed it when I was with Lazy Boy Rocker Recliner Company. We helped sponsor a Memorial Day service for Detroit Zone. And being that I had come back from the Air Force, we had an Air Force flyover there with A-10s. They probably could have used a few of those up there at the time. Thank you much.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
They did have planes. They had some British planes up there. And there was one, there's a Bolshevik plane. Yeah, that's a very famous anecdote on the railroad front. This plane crashed. And I think it was the then 3rd Battalion commander. Mike was just posting about this the other day. And he goes running towards this plane and he says, "Hey, don't shoot. We're Americans." And they start shooting at him. He didn't know they were Bolsheviks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nelson. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah,
One
thanks.
other thing. We were honored to go to the dedication.
The week I told him that we sponsored that thing. So.
One more question from David.
Yes, yeah, this is Dave Huffman. I was just going to say that my grandpa was Benjamin Jandro, and he was in the polar bear outfit. And I can remember when we were little guys, me and my older brother, we used to sit on his lap, and he had bullet holes left from the war that we'd stick our little fingers in. But he always there in the front of when we go into his house, he had one of the Smokey the Bear hat on, one an oval picture, and he had very, very broad chested, and he had just lined with medals. But I don't know what his activity, but I do know he was there. And I hear you say Guardian Angel and all these different names. I know them was all pieces of his war history, you know.
Well, you might want to check with Mike or the Bentley and maybe do some research. Find out what unit he was with anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys did a great job.